So my presentation includes two different parts. The first one is mainly theoretical and regards my personal reflection on the theme of the symbol and the transcendent function, which take into account both Jungian and Kleinian Bionian positions. The second part is an excerpt from an infant observation which aims at showing how the capacity for symbolization and for the transcendent function to unfold can be studied in the early phases of mother-baby relationship. The transcendent function can be seen as the expression of the symbolic prerogative of the mind, marking a divide between automatism and transformation, or between solitude and sterility on the one hand, and creative encounter on the other. We should therefore at this point define the meaning of the term symbol, seeing the contradiction in the use that Jung himself makes in his works. Taking a cue from the definition in Psychological Types, we can deduce that Jung gave back to the symbol a complex function, describing it as an instrument of synthesis within the psychological organism. Jung's symbol is substantially non-semantic. It does not fall back on any known meaning. It has a pragmatic, operative function and works to compose psychic elements that are disjointed and often dramatically torn. A fundamental property of the symbol is that of enclosing in itself, and thus procreating, by that meaning the extending of creativity in space and time, those contents that only the actual lived destiny of the individual will render explicit and factual. In this sense, the symbol is the agent in the process of individuation, the latter being, as Mario Trevi states, the never-ending fruit that cannot be concluded in the process of the establishment of nexuses. But the use of the concept of symbol made by Jung in other writings and the use of images made in clinical practice by analytical psychology seem to take back the symbol to the archetype. This contradiction opens the road to a massive misunderstanding made by many of Jung's interpreters that reduce the symbol to the archetypal image, and therefore to the sensitive aspect of a hypothetical, a priori, and non-historical function of imagination. But in following this road, we immediately lose the principal characteristic of the symbol, which is that of tensional synthesis. So, on the contrary, I would say, in regarding the symbol, Umberto Galimberti's statement seems to me to be particularly clarifying. He says, what is in play is the passage from the order of explanation, Erklärung in German, presided over by the categories of reason, to the order of meaning, Sinn, which transcends such categories. We could say that the problem of the symbol and the transcendent function moves in the realm of the creation of meaning and needs to be distinguished from the realm of the unveilment, explanation of that which is known but hidden. On this matter, in the psychoanalytic area of thought, Bion's standpoint indicates that the purely iconographical cognitive meaning is to be considered as an empty box that makes sense only if it can convey emotions that unite and create a meaningful relationship between the two partners. Symbolization is thus a form of creative joining, and the symbolic area is shared between two objects that are placed in a reciprocal relationship. From this standpoint, the analytic interpretation do not convey a fully representative meaning, Erklärung, but remain in the area of the unsaturated, thus containing a creative project. Zin. The symbol remains alive, in the sense of Jung, and maintains a portion of unknown because it is not a simple explanation of the known and composes emotionally that which pre-exists in a partially recognizable shape. It not only maintains a part of pre-existing unknown, but it opens up a new unknown that partially replaces the preceding one, thus stimulating new research and the desire to proceed with the analytic work. The tertium thus becomes the unexpected newborn of the transcendent function and concerns not only the epiphany of something previously unexisting, but also the modification of the unknown, whose movement becomes the principal motor of each successive symbolization. In confronting some of Jung's alchemical writings, we notice that in the alchemical metaphor, transference is placed within the dimension of an emotional realm that comprises the individual's specific history without being reduced to a simple reliving of past events. Transference instead places itself in the realm of that which is created in the actual dyadic quaternary relation. It starts from the baggage of initially limited and primitive possibilities of relation and operates to develop their qualitative transformation. So the transference is the matrix of the symbol. Therefore, similarly to Bion's thought, it is actually possible to state that the symbolic function is placed by Jung within the relational dimension. The symbol is not just intracyclic, but relational. Another methodological and theoretical problem arises at this point. Are we authorists and thereby at risk of falling into a causalistic perspective to attempt an inquiry into the psychogenesis of the transcendent function? Even with the risk of this contradiction and without the archetypes to rescue us, we must suppose that such psychological capacity, the transcendent function, has its own origin in the development of the individual and that there are specific impediments to its mature unfolding, which latter we should be able to observe in the infant and the child and to re-encounter in the analytic room, mainly in the most regressive situations. Developmental psychology needs to be redefined, and it is not to be considered necessarily as a psychology of causality, or as one that limits its own function to the unveilment of an ineluctable destiny hidden behind the illusory freedom of consciousness. It must not be regarded as the psychology of the Erklärungen. Developmental psychology can and must be, within the healthy boundaries of hermeneutics, a psychology researching the origin of symbolizing capacity of the mind and of the disturbances of this capacity. In other terms, a psychology of the origins of meaning and its pathology. Here too, Bion's lesson teaches us not to look for phases, stages, and semantic reductions, but to look for transformations of emotional events within a relational dyad from the origins of existence onwards. So now, attending to the transcendent function and involving the position and the role of the ego means entering the territory of knowledge and of its development or impediment in the ontogenesis. By knowledge, I mean here that which Bion defines a possibility to learn from one's own experiences of love and hate. The transcendent function has in this way a strong correlation with the Oedipal problem. If we interpret the Oedipal myth in the light of the drive forcing to cognitive penetration, we can see how this necessity is dramatically linked to the dimension of pride. Therefore, next to the wish of uncovering the truth at all costs, lies the anxiety of the emotional catastrophe linked to an operation bordering on outrage against the mind's inertia. It follows that the necessity of thinking thoughts and of uniting them creatively is interposed by the arrangement of two mutually interacting elements. On the one hand, we can place the excess sadistic elements that are linked projectively to the image of the parent's intercourse, perceived as destructive, and that turns out to be insufficiently elaborated and metabolized by the maternal reverie. This is supposing that the image of the parental intercourse can correspond to a possibility of intrapsychic interaction, conjunctio, and thus to the capacity for symbolic activity in the way of the transcendent function. Another essential element to be considered apart from the maternal reverie is the degree to which the infant can tolerate frustration. The second element, which is emphasized by Bion, is established by the catastrophic anxiety linked to becoming and to the disclosure of the ultimate psychic reality, the psychic background behind immediate experience that Bion calls hope. The term catastrophic appears like a two-headed Janus. On the one hand, it sends back to the psychotic catastrophe in the breakup of the container and the fragmentation of thinking function. On the other, to the feeling of risk and unpredictability to which, for its own growth process, the thinking function is exposed to each time it must contain a new idea. So, within this perspective, the symbolic act, the creative intuition born out of relation, is close in its genesis to the disturbing nature also present in the hallucinatory phenomena. It represents the mental equivalent to the sequence intercourse, pregnancy, delivery. Bion also warns of a kind of language that, like lies, is used to inhibit thought and is produced to take the place of an emotionally disturbing reality. In this view, the worst interpretations an analyst can give are not significant, where to the contrary, by significant, we allude to being able to induce, contain, and transform those meanings that are present but as yet unknown in the relation. This is the theme that Bion treats when he deals with the transformation in hallucinosis, that are the result of a catastrophe that has destroyed the container and that concern the establishing of absent relations. So, faced with primitive catastrophe, the personality adopts defenses that try to avoid pain and panic by evacuating through the sensory organs the functions capable of perceiving and registering them. The individual shall then behave as if certain parts of his personality, his very emotions, were to have physical properties, with the consequence that even words and ideas become sensitive objects. The mind and the perceptual organs are used as a kind of evacuatory muscle. In this respect, the verbal communication is also a mixture of meaningless concrete elements that must be got rid of. Bion has often repeated that the clarification of a primitive emotion depends on it being contained in a detoxifying receptacle, where emotions contained and the detoxifying receptacle, container, constitute a conjunctio in the sense of Jung. Only through a series of favorable experiences with understanding and welcoming objects, does the individual develop the capacity to learn from his experiences of love and hate. He enabled his own internal elements to remain unsaturated. That means retaining the live operative potential of the symbol, avoiding to prematurely ascribe a fixed and false meaning to one's emotions. To the contrary, in the individual in whom transformations in hallucinosis occur, the concept of the container is totally missing. Then the frustration linked to the missing good breast cannot be tolerated, and the known breast that in normal conditions would become a symbol is hallucinated as bad persecutory breast. Bion maintains that the mind depends on the truth the same way the organism depends on food, and that a condition where the emotional experience is avoided has disastrous consequences on the development of the personality. So reality and the emotional truth of an individual can be brought closer together by the tolerance of fragmented and dispersed elements, of their chaotic movement, and by remaining in a frustrating condition of waiting that introduces to a temporary peace given by a moment of clarity and balance. This capacity, which the analysand must learn and the analyst continuously relearn, is founded on the emotional experience of an adequately functioning mother-child relationship. Memory and desire undermine this capacity in the analytic situation, the former because of its relationship with the already known, and the latter because it directs research. Thus, they both kill the symbolic potential of the mind. The analyst, who is a prisoner of memory and desire, prisoner of his own signs mistaken for symbols, is trapped by his own lies, and will behave like a mother that in front of her child will see either a previous child, an ideal child, or a persecutory child, but not the one actually existing in his or her specific emotional uniqueness. The analysand, like the child, will then need to fall back on functionings characterized by an omnipotence and omniscience that involve a pseudo-growth. The lie, in this context, is structured as a barrier against all propositions that would conduct to an emotional turbulence, which would be experienced as catastrophic. The liar, whether analyst or analysand, cannot tolerate abandoning the familiar reality of his own vocabulary of signs, with which he builds pseudo-interpretations. He cannot reach into the realm of the unsaturated, where the symbol fills voids and opens other voids, where both the full and the void involve disruptive emotions, and the void is a source of pain. This should make us consider the transcendent function, when it's really operative, as a process accompanied by psychic pain, certainly not filled with idealistic luminosities, where the umbra solis displays all its disconcerting weight. And now we come to the baby. So, my notes concern some excerpts from an infant observation. It is evident that the intention is not of giving a complete view of everything observed, and I also do not wish to pose on the applications and significance of the method. I will only say that the observation was conducted for 2 years according to the method devised by Esther Beek, and that the phenomena observed have been interpreted in a post-Kleinian light that bears in mind Bion's influence. I wish to show through certain sequences the problems in the development of symbolization encountered by this child. To me, They seem particularly significant as they may show how a very disturbed or psychotic-like thinking originates. Obviously, this does not mean that all of this child's relationship with his mother is disastrous. To the contrary, it has been a relationship in which the mother was always moved by a wish to encounter her child within the limits of her mental capacities, and the child showed tenacity and strength in creating the bond, all of which probably avoided more serious damages. Since the situations I will show have been chosen among the more disturbed, they may give the impression of a more pathological relationship than really took place. The first situation concerns the collapse of the maternal reverie at 19 days of life. Matthew, the baby. Has been crying since early morning. It's the first time this has happened. The mother receives me with a stressed look on her face and tells me that today has been a disaster. A friend holds him in her arms and tries to console him without succeeding. He is calm for only a few instants and then resumes crying. The friend seems to realize that Matthew is suffering from a stomach ache, a colic. She tries to better position him, give him a pacifier, and rocks him. The fact that she is saying that according to her it's a stomach ache is not changing the mother's attitude, who seems not to understand. The mother keeps repeating that this has all happened because a bad woman had arrived that morning and woken Matthew, who had been sleeping peacefully. He had woken up and been restless since then. It was about 6 o'clock p.m. at that moment, so he has been crying for about 8 or 9 hours. So he had woken up and been restless since then, and not eaten or wanted the breast. During the entire observation, the mother had stayed sitting in a corner behind the kitchen table. She eats her meal and watches Matthew, who is crying in her friend's lap. She keeps repeating the story of the woman in the morning and that she does not know what is wrong with Matthew. Twice during the observation she bursts out crying, and when her friend talks to her of Matthew's stomach ache, she seems not to understand, even not to listen. When Matthew contracts his legs and his face turns purple, she does not understand, keeps her distance, and does not touch him for the whole hour. That situation at 19 days, seemingly dramatic because of the tension, huge tension, that had been created, shows a complete inability at that moment to catch mentally the sense of the baby's painful experience. This experience is felt by the mother as a persecution, probably even more by the mother than by the baby, who at least was being held by the other woman and projected onto the bad woman of the morning. Especially absent is the maternal capacity to give meaning to the experience, notwithstanding the fact that the situation was pretty evident and was being mediated by her friend. At that moment the mother has an impenetrable barrier to the physical and emotional state of the baby. At other times that were less dramatic, this mother, showing partial insight, told me explicitly of being unable to understand her child's manifestations unless they were temporally correlated to events that had become usual at certain times. If, for example, Matthew cries at a certain time, it can be hunger or sleep, but if he cries out of time or after a breastfeed, that reason escapes her. Only if the facts are concretely recognizable do they obtain an adequate response on a formal level, which is yet invariably insufficient on the emotional level. Insufficient not in the sense of an incomplete, of a complete inadequateness, but in the sense that it is an emotion that is habitual and not reinvented from time to time. This would seem to indicate that the mother functions at the level that Hannah Siegel would define symbolic equation. She places together events in virtue of their similarity and of their concrete presence, but is incapable of inventing meaning and functioning on the symbolic level when in the absence of familiar events. What I have described displayed itself very clearly during the period of breastfeeding through Matthew's relation to the breast. Usually Matthew is connected to the breast for exclusively nutritional purposes. He is never allowed to play with the breast, which is quickly taken away at the end of the feed. The child does not hold the breast whilst feeding. His body is hypotonic, even though he sucks with a certain strength. Frequently, the mother has a contradicting attitude. At times, she seems to reprimand the child that he is eating too much, wolfing, and that he will vomit later, giving him the breast whilst she is saying that. To the contrary, soon after, she tells him that she is not eating enough and growing properly, and takes the breast away. The sequences of giving and taking away the breast alternate each other and are accompanied by verbal sequences of "you have too much" or "you haven't had enough" that are incongruent with the behavior. Matthew seems to adapt passively, protests little, and gives the impression of complying with the mother, of hypostimulating her in respect to that which could upset her, like violent crying or intense anger. However, Matthew regurgitates frequently in the intervals between feeds and sometimes even during the breastfeeding. He, however, holds the nipple firmly in his mouth and gives the impression of being someone who does not give up. The regurgitations go on for the whole first year of life. Matthew grows up with difficulty. The mother is distressed because he does not grow, and at the appearance of the regurgitations, she cleans up mechanically whilst repeating, "Here is the usual, here is the usual." This seems very indicative to me of how the destructive circle of repetition compulsion is created. On the one hand is the undigested infantile element that is expelled. On the other hand, there is the incapacity of the mother to digest the element. This same element cannot but become the usual. This shows the inability to give meaning to the new, even if it is painful, transforming it into something of significance that propels forward. It is actually mental pain, potentially linked to vomit. That is the aspect that cannot be thought. This entails that vomit, by remaining without meaning, stays insignificant and usual. This inability to give meaning to what enters and leaves the mouth is evident in the method of feeding. One can notice the fracture, the disjunctio, between the mother's words and her behavior. The child is exposed to the emotional weight of this fracture and cannot introject a bond between physical acts, emotions, and words adequate to describe such a bond. This can be seen as a precursor to successive difficulties that this child will have in the areas of language and play. I would like to take a brief look at the phenomenon observed in the first months of life that can have several meanings, but that I mention in relation to the problem I have been exploring. The mother's distraction, understood as the elimination of the child from her mental space, provokes in him very clear symptoms of muscular hypotonia and a flattening of facial mimicry. In his very first months, Matthew goes limp like a rag, and as he gets older, he tends to suddenly lose the ability to organize the game he was playing and to wander around lost, without goal, until the mother reels him back in. It is a phenomenon that underscores the vital importance of containment by the maternal mind for the development of the child and for both his physical and psychic survival. The difference between mental and physical containment is obvious when the episodes of hypotonia occurred whilst Matthew was in his mother's arms, but she was not thinking of him. The relation between Matthew and his mother evolves more positively as he improves his motor capacities and his general level of performance. These are aspects that the mother holds dear. She has always stimulated Matthew, affectionately and delicately, to learn to move a lot and to learn games of manual dexterity. As far as we can understand, this corresponded in the mother's mind to an attempt to create internally a more recognizable, less enigmatic and unknown child, as is the one that cries, vomits, or is unpredictable. In a certain sense, it was positive that Matthew complied by learning, as she expected, to move precautiously and to become able in manual or motor games. In fact, the mother has been reassured and has effectively learned to tune into the child. Around the first birthday, there were times of play between mother and child that, for the intimacy and emotional intensity created, were reminiscent of breastfeeding, though this had been missing at the time of real feeding. Thus, within certain limits, cognitive learning has enabled Matthew to experiment more primitive aspects of the relationship with the breast that were previously inadequately experienced. It is nevertheless significant that these more positive interactions revolved around concrete games with colored plastic hard toys intended to facilitate the acquisition of skills. They were repetitive games played within the context of the usual, in the sense I was discussing above. At times, though, Matthew seemed to gravitate towards soft objects that he clutched to himself, pieces of cloth, labels, various substitutes of the nipple. These activities were totally devoid of meaning for the mother, who after a while would intervene by proposing the usual games to the child. The positive aspect in the acquisition of these gaming skills lost its power in the second year of life. The games became more repetitive and were repeated mechanically by Matthew. He adapted to a well-defined task set by the mother. The mother's necessity to evacuate the unpredictable involves the need to watch the usual game again and again and misinterpret it as growth. It seems to me that this is the central problem in defective symbolization. It is the way in which the already known continuously replaces the new and becomes a lie, pretending to be the signal of the development that is in fact eliminated. Obviously, the above-mentioned aspects find their more evident manifestations in the area of language. Matthew has not spoken a word until he is 20 months old. At that time, he begins a type of vocalization composed of guttural and labial sounds that is accompanied by much gesticulating and has the intonation of adult talk, which however remains devoid of meaning for the mother. Apparently, it is a vocalization that is prevalently imitative, in which a certain effort to communicate something comprehensible is nevertheless noticed. It remains a discourse without words. For several weeks, this baby talk repeats itself in rhythm and sound, accompanied by the same mimicry. At times it is agitated, the mother does not understand, and tension is created. Slowly, whilst continuing these discourses, Matthew pronounces the words water and thank you. The discourses continue as if he were unable to hook his internal reality to an adequate expressive modality. Imitation does not bridge the gap. By parallel, following moments of more communicative play, as when he involves me with a ball, are the repetitions of mechanical games that he now plays with great skill. But this is a movement totally detached from desire. His expression is indifferent. He feels no joy in success or anger in failure. I would now quote two situations which I regard as very important and which occurred around about the age of 22 months. In the first one, Matthew is standing on his bed and starts the baby talk, pointing to a non-definable direction. After asking a few times what he wants, the mother gives a false interpretation. She says that Matthew is pointing in the direction of the wall, which is just behind him, towards some paintings that used to be there days before, adding comments on the fact that if they had stayed there, they would have been broken. Matthew, on hearing mother's words, turns to face the wall where the pictures used to be, and he has obviously changed position, adapting himself to the mother's interpretation. It seems that the situation is indicative of how the lack of maternal reverie and the attempt to saturate falsely and prematurely the emotional experience and the upset linked with it eliminates the ability to wait, which, through the tolerance of disorder, would create meaning out of the gesticulating baby talk. This creates, instead of the dynamism of the symbol, an abdication. One's own personal emotional experience is not perceived as such, and it is not received in the mental space. To the contrary, there is a compliance with what is recognizable but false, and with what eliminates conflict and psychological tension. The second sequence I am quoting, always the same age. Matthew is playing with a ball. When holding the ball and watching it, he says, "Who is it? Who is it?" Which is quite complicated in English as an expression, because in Italian it's more simple. It is chi è, and he said "Cu è," like that. which resembles "Chi è?" Who is it? And the father says, "Have you farted?" And the mother, looking at me, adds, "Because you know, when he asks who it is because he has farted." To conclude, it seems relevant that at 22 months this child says, "Who is it?" as if to indicate that what is at stake here is his identity. This evidently creates a bridge in our minds with the problem of our patience in analysis and of the mental level from which our interpretations originate. For this child it is rather meaningful that the incomprehension of his intestinal cases at 19 days has become the interpretation of the fact that mother and father make of his "who is it." Words are empty signs or smelly air. One's identity is confused with them. To produce or become farts seems to be the price paid to guarantee the tranquility that signs bring about, with the elimination of the upset and pain linked with symbols. Matthew's quest is thus what engages the analyst in his daily work. Hopefully our response should be better than Matthew's parents. Thank you. Are we on time?
Yes, please. Just need to rest a few minutes before the questions. Thank you very much.
I'm very happy to talk about Matthew because it's now 1 year since I haven't seen him. And it is still such a painful experience in my mind, as you can imagine. This is why I had this necessity to share this experience with people, because it's so painful to see the development of a baby when things go wrong and you cannot do anything but being a warm witness, warm, silent, thinking witness and nothing else. So this is why I really needed to write something about him. Because I think that the mind is necessary in front of this kind of situations, and not only one, probably.
The thing I'm always struck by in daily observations, though, is how what seem to be very pathological developments can be very fluid. Mm-hmm. And you see developments where you don't expect them, where something seems to be going very wrong, and things can change quite a lot later on. And you were referring to how this wasn't the whole of the relationship.
Yeah.
Maybe you were thinking that, or rather maybe you have seen other things that he's got in himself that can mitigate some of the
he was
destruction to civilization.
He was a very strong baby and child in some way. I remember when he was kept on, he remained latched onto the nipple, even when vomiting. And so really that was very intense, you know. And this, I would say, on the part of the baby, it was in some way strong, and I think that to a certain extent it was quite helpful that he was compliant to a certain extent, not overstimulating the mother, and not giving her too many anxieties. So she actually could learn something. Nearly at the end of the first year, things went better between them from an emotional standpoint. That was the best. I mean, I think he could build some good internal object in that period of his life, actually. And she, in some way, she was always with Matthew, and always speaking with him, and always trying to do her best. I mean, unfortunately, she was really, she has a lot of difficulties in understanding the emotional situation.
I'd be very wary, though, about this observation of his hanging onto the nipple while vomiting, because it sounds like something you might describe as an insufficient splitting.
Yeah.
Where the good object and the bad object are confused, and where he's evacuating and taking in at the same time, as though there isn't really enough distinction. Not paranoid enough.
But then he falls into it in quite a catastrophic way.
Well, could be described, generally speaking, but you know, he vomited so many times without having the nipple in his mouth, and so he really kept on vomiting and vomiting and vomiting, you know, dozens of times every day.
It means spitting up the breast milk. Yeah.
Regurgitating.
Yeah.
When he was 19 days old, that woman said that she thought he had a stomach ache, and you seem to be implying that and I was wondering how did you have thoughts about how he got the stomach ache?
Oh, you mean how he could have this stomach ache? Well, I don't know, actually. I'm quite sure it was a problem of interpreting what was happening, and I wasn't there for that. I was there just for observing the situation. But I suppose that what the other woman said could be right, because he turns purple in his face and contracts his legs, you know, this kind of movements. Of course, I cannot be sure about that, but that was a possible. It was a possible interpretation. Quite could be the good one.
But
Yes, I was wondering about this bad woman there.
Yes.
And whether she didn't get into his stomach. That mother put the bad woman in his stomach, and then disconnected and left him with it.
Yeah. I think that was this bad woman, because I think that probably in reality this was just a normal person coming in the morning, and maybe a bit more noisy than required, you know. But of course this was a bad persecutory object on the part of the mother, who was projected into the baby at that moment, and was probably this bad maternal object who was in Matthew's stomach. Became painful and something like that, you know.
Turned into the gas.
Yeah.
But you're making an assumption as well that the bad persecutory object has been projected by the mother into the baby, whereas in fact it may be the baby's own.
Well,
bad
I
internal
think
object.
that surely it is the baby's own.
Yes.
We can fantasize
Absolutely.
about a projection on the part of the mother, but we cannot be sure. What was sure was that Matthew was in a persecutory state.
Right. And the
So
mother
that was
too.
his own, and the mother was too.
Exactly.
Even more.
Well,
I think even more, you know, and so we can speculate that this was also a projection on the part of the mother. But what was the point is that the mother couldn't understand anything.
the difficulty is containing that projection. There's
No,
no.
because there wasn't any sense of the mother empathizing with the baby's pain. It was really that if we could get rid of the bad word. we'd get rid
Well,
of it.
was it that, or could one perhaps see it, that the mother was knowing her baby in that moment? Just as she was, there was some other point where I hadn't thought it when I'd read the paper a couple of times, but as you were reading it, other moments, oh yes, about at the breast, where your mother seems to be doing these totally sort of incongruent things, that in terms of her need to know her baby and know how her baby would react, she was in that moment knowing her baby. She was making it such that it would be true that he would be sick, and was actually sick actually at the nipple, and was making it true that her baby wouldn't grow, wouldn't have enough. And similarly, her baby had stomachache. She, in that sense, knew her baby.
Sorry, could you explain your question a little bit, because I'm not sure I got your point.
I've forgotten the start of it. I just have the sense that all these things that Mother does, which seem to be so strange, are ways of making her baby be the baby that she would understand, that she would know. You know, I've got a baby that shrinks too much and is sick. I've got a baby that fails to thrive. And it seems incongruent, her behaviour. But if she's desperate to generate...
Yes, to force the baby into her preconceptions.
Yes.
You're meaning that?
Yes.
That's sure. I mean, she had a lot of books. Yeah. When
one of the problems that, as I see it, as you saw it, I think, that the mother could not know. She always had to know.
Yeah.
And she went to the first idea that she had, and she stuck to it.
Yeah.
And so there was no space for the symbolic function to develop, and for an IU to develop. I find that fascinating because in your last sentence, you also really talked about us and our work in analysis, whether we rush with interpretation, or whether we can wait. And this mother couldn't wait, it seems. And so she always clung to the old, and what she thought she knew, and therefore didn't really get to know her baby properly. Baby had to fit her ideas, rather than she fitted the baby's ideas of field experiences.
Actually, this mother taught me a lot. Yeah, because we know everything. In some way, we know everything, and so we can immediately vomit, I would say, our interpretations, you know, and so often, just to prevent true emotions to come up and, you know, to be processed. given the time to do that, but not losing also the time, because it's also a problem of not losing the right moments.
It also seems sometimes when you give the wrong interpretation or the wrong, you think you've understood and it's completely wrong from your patient's point of view. This appalling sense of loneliness and isolation that patient is left with, as though all hope of a bond and a meeting, and I mean this catastrophic break, which is something that baby, I imagine, must feel all the time.
And sometimes patients react with aggressiveness to our wrong interpretation, and then so often we interpret their reaction as a resistance, while they're absolutely right. So often, this is the problem. What you said is absolutely correct. She had a lot of books, and she knew everything about the development of babies. So she expected, for instance, that at a certain age a baby would do certain, and so she expected the time of hunger, the time of changing the napkins. It was everything was fixed, and so when Matthew cried, she watched her watch and said, "Oh, this must be hunger." Like that. It was so painful. Staying there was absolutely painful.
It seems like she did link with an aspect of his experience, the persecution, but that she wasn't able to make a link between that. That she became overcome by that. She became the bad breast mother. She sat across from the table, she cried, she couldn't function.
At
she
19
couldn't
days.
make a link between that and the good mother, the good breast for the baby. She couldn't be that transcendent emotion. And somehow hold those two.
Yeah, you are thinking about the 19 days observation in particular.
It seems to me she is linking with an aspect of the baby, but that one aspect becomes the whole experience.
I think so.
Could you tell us anything about what the relationship had been earlier, before the 19 days? Had there been, you talk about conjuncture, and I'm interested in the link that you're making with the transcendent function, which is the bringing together and taking it forward creatively. But had there been a good mother-infant conjuncture before this catastrophic break?
It is difficult to say, because actually Matthew was born a couple of weeks before the date.
That he was due.
That he was due.
That's interesting.
So this is, we could say, the experience of birth. The real first, the integration, we could say, which turns to be a disintegration experience. During the first couple of weeks, he almost slept, and nothing else. Was sleeping, and and the mother was in some way already in her pregnancy, so she hadn't the experience.
She was
still in her pregnancy. We cannot say it was a good relationship, because there was no relationship, I would say.
Well, it was still very much a fused relationship, perhaps. But I'm not quite convinced about this theoretical time when the baby should have been born. It sounds a little bit like the theory, oh, he's crying, he's hungry, but it's 6 o'clock. he was born when he wanted to be
Well,
born.
can be. I mean, it's a model of the mind. We can use different models, of course. There are so many models. So, I mean, we can use this one of the integration and then of the integration at a certain time. I would say that nothing happened, actually. Nothing happened emotionally.
So would that mean that almost the first thing which did happen?
The mother just couldn't relate to a really existing baby before this episode. She was relating to a fantasy, completely a fantasy baby. Because Matthew was quite like non-existing, always sleeping, you know. He was still a non-existing baby.
Is it possible to say, though, that his experience of the de-integration of birth was so enormous that he had to spend the next 19 days reintegrating, or in some way trying to integrate it?
Mm-hmm. Possible?
Louis?
I'd like to widen the discussion a bit, if I may, because there is some controversy within this society as to the extent to which the climb beyond Meltzer tradition is something which we can link with Jungian ideas. And I think that is the main point of your paper, is to make that kind of synthesis. So I have just one or two remarks or questions about that.
Mm-hmm.
It caught my ear particularly when you said that the baby at 19 days was certainly, you said certainly, suffering from persecution or persecutory anxiety. I think that's actually very questionable. That would be a Kleinian interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most infant researchers wouldn't draw that conclusion. Having said that, I noticed in your infant observation that you make a very, perhaps I better stand, you make a very important shift, I think, from what I understand to be Mrs. Bick's method, because I was talking very recently to a Kleinian analyst who said how wonderful Mrs. Bick taught infant observation, and he said what he most valued about it was that you were taught, you concentrated on the baby. You simply didn't regard the mother. And you actually, in your observation, you've done the reverse. You've really talked a lot about the mother, the mother's fantasies, and so on. So I welcome that, because you're actually looking at an interaction rather than simply speculating about the baby's fantasies, which is one of the criticisms of the Kleinian approach. The other thing is that I think that Bion's model is very limited in a way with his idea of the container and of reverie. You see, to talk about this mother as being lacking in reverie seems rather an understatement. But the problem is that reverie is not something which Bion really explained very much. It's just a kind of state which we have to try to imagine. And I just wonder whether other models, for example mirroring, the kind of thing Winnicott talked about, the importance of the mother's face, for example, in the interaction with the baby, might not be considered. Because the Bion model is very much based on the alimentary canal, isn't it? The ingestion and evacuation of painful experiences. And I suppose my final question is this really to do with the transcendent function? I think that's what, I was left no doubt about that. I think maybe we need to discuss that a little more, whether the the conjunctia, as Jung described in the alchemical pictures, is actually something which one can observe, which is what you're suggesting. You're talking about the conjunctia between the mother and child. That still seems to me a very vague and uncertain kind of parallel to make.
Thank you. A lot of questions. I'm trying to do my best, okay? So, about what you said about considering both mother and baby in interaction, I think that this is now very usual in all infant observation seminars run in Italy, as far as I know, because because of the theoretical development in the psychoanalytic field about symbol and symbolization, which is considered to happen always in a dyad, always in a relationship, inside the relationship. Actually, many psychoanalysts criticize Jung thought because they say that the Jung's concept of symbol is just intrapsychic and not relational. This is their criticism. And so usually when we work in the infant observation seminars, we always try to focus on the baby and on the mother, on their relationship. I agree that the Bion's model, of course it is not the only one, and the Winnicottian model is also extremely helpful to understand this phenomena, extremely helpful. I think that here the problem of the importance of reverie, I mean using the model of the Bionian model and the concept of reverie, here is particularly helpful. Because, for instance, when this mother was not really thinking of Matthew, when she forgot him, when she couldn't think of him, she had this somatic phenomena. He had hypotonia, and even later he couldn't play any longer. So, in my opinion, this is very indicative of the importance of the maternal mental activity defined as reverie. I think in this case it's particularly helpful.
Sorry.
Oh, you can interrupt me.
No, I think. Were you still answering the? Were you still?
Well, if there are some more questions, I mean, we can say that. I assure you, I will answer your last question.
Just about the idea of this mother being able to have what I understand by maternal reverie. It seemed to me that she herself is in a very borderline state, and it seemed to me that she's not perceiving her baby, that she's in it's a state of projective identification, in fact, with the baby, and that her insistence on the baby doing what she wants is because she simply isn't separate enough from the baby to perceive the baby at any level as her baby that's actually born. And I think this is interesting that she perceives her baby as being 2 weeks premature, so that when the baby's asleep, so that in a sense for 14 days she perhaps hasn't got a concept of a baby that's born. So that I feel that the idea of reverie, which suggests to me the capacity in the mother to digest and formulate the baby's experiences for him, doesn't quite work there. That you'd have to call it something else, like projective identification. That's just the word reverie.
It's interesting. Projective identification is the precondition of reverie.
Maybe precondition, yeah.
The precondition of reverie.
But she's living in that.
If it is not persecutory, if it's not evacuative, it is a precondition of reverie. Is that what you mean?
Yes, but that she's not. It's a precondition for her as well. I mean that she can't. She isn't able. She's not actually. One would suppose able to formulate for herself.
Yeah.
But you mentioned, to your own interest, I think, the fact that when he's a bit older, she could play with him. And you even think that it's almost a bit like breastfeeding, that there was a certain freedom there, which he didn't have in the actual experience. And you're quite puzzled by that, and I think I was too.
No, I thought you weren't puzzled. I thought you were saying that the games were repetitive and unproductive.
They became, in the second year, they became repetitive and meaningless. But, there were just, we would say, 4 or 5 months between the age of 7 months to 1 year about. And when Matthew developed his skills to play, and the mother was really enthusiastic, and he started walking very, very soon, and she was absolutely happy about that. And so they had a good attunement, They really met emotionally in that period. I think they were both happy at that time.
You focus on emotion a lot, and I feel that there's a sort of area of healthy autism that's missing. Perhaps in this area of pre-symbolic, an area of sense, Winnicottian, maternal preoccupation, sensuous, like the eyes, the face, sound, touch, smell, touching against. That whole area, it feels, is difficult. She doesn't know what to do at all with. And in a way, I get the feeling from the first part of the paper that there isn't sensation isn't an area you explore. It starts with emotion, as if there's nothing before emotion. And I feel there's an area in life that's not about emotion.
How would you separate very early sensation from the experience of a feeling, that you have an emotion that accompanies a sensation? How would you imagine that for a baby?
I don't know. I think it's not as, when there isn't an inside, emotions tend to be things that you have inside. There's a skin already formed. I think there's possibly a sense of self that develops at the skin, at the surface, before there's an inside and outside.
So you have a way of picturing that a baby could feel the softness of the breast or the warmth of the breast, but not have an emotion about it?
Perhaps both, but perhaps at some area of experience there is a sensation that doesn't necessarily have initially an emotion, and sometimes is connected and sometimes isn't. and like you say, I mean, essentially, I mean, like the face against the breast, and like Tustin talks about feelings of touching up against.
Well, of course it depends on the definition we give to the emotion. You seem to give a very elaborated I think you're already thinking of an emotion linked with a representation in some way. We could say in Freudian terms, somehow already represented. While actually I regard it as a really on a pre-representation level. Functioning on a primary process level, we could say in Freudian terms, very before any representation, I would say.
Yes, Georgia. I want to start a new subject, so if you're not quite finished. Well, not a new subject, but I was, it really refers to the paragraph in which you talk about the explanation of that which is known but hidden, as opposed to the creation of meaning, and that whole notion of the hermeneutic, that distinction within the hermeneutic. And I'm really grateful to you for bringing that to our attention in relation to Jung and the symbolic and how he got confused about it as well. And I think that's quite important. And I think that, in a way, although Jung and Freud seem very different, they were both from the same tradition and had a scientific training in the same time. And they both, of course, had that tendency to want to find real causes, as it were, and they sort of struggled with the same sorts of problems in quite different sorts of ways. So, I think that's probably why Jung's, was sort of half got the idea but couldn't really stick to it. And I think we all do the same. And the point I would make is that I think we're doing it now, because I think when we look at this baby observation, in a way, there's a tendency to try and want to find out what really happened. And if you're really sticking with the hermeneutic, then, in a way, everybody's interpretation is part of that process. And for us to have a superior interpretation is falling back into saying, well, we know what really happened, and they only think they know what really happened. Now that's a problem, by which I'm not saying that we should give up our analytic perspective, but it's a much more problematic thing. And then you have a new problematic, which is, how do people go about interpreting?
Well, that's great.
How do we do it? And you could say, just to extend that one more bit, you could say that we here are contributing to a process by which how one understands what babies are and what babies do eventually leaks back into the culture, which of course all our sort of ideas have. And they become part of the resources that mothers use to interpret what's happening to their baby. So the baby is constructed by and we're all at it.
So what are we doing? What are we doing here?
We can't do it, we can get better at it, but I think if you're really sticking to the idea of hermeneutics, that's the problem we've got to stay with.
So. I think this is the central problem. I think this would require a whole night to be discussed. But I think that the main point which Jung himself picked up, which was essential, is that the observer, with his model, is implied in the thing observed. And then so
he really was onto it very, very early.
Yes, of course.
It's amazing insight, really.
Of course. And so the problem is that you cannot avoid using yourself as a person, as a whole person, but you cannot also avoid using your theoretical model. You need at least to have one model in order to observe, because this is how the mind functions. I mean, you need to link an emotion with a representation immediately.
Well, yes, I know, but I mean, I think there's a methodological problem about observation, and it's here in this paper.
Yeah.
And that is that, in a way, you wanted to make a point about observation, so you picked out of this observation the things that would make your point.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, I know that one has to do that, and you did say that you were doing that at the beginning.
Yeah.
But it's
I know,
still
but
a problem.
yes, I know, but I think it's impossible to avoid that, because every time you have to pick up a problem and to describe something, you really have to enter the details, and you have to use your models, and you have to, in some way, use your vocabulary.
Yes.
Otherwise, we cannot communicate anything.
No, but
you see,
then can't make
the point of your
predictions
paper.
from what you've said.
Right.
The point of your paper seems to be exactly that, to warn against rushing in with interpretations and discussions. And when you say you learned a lot from the mother, I think we learned, at least I learned a lot from your paper and from Matthew.
Yes.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that we can predict what's going to happen next.
But it makes a very important point about interpretations, which I think, as Rosemary was saying, I would like to have some more discussion on this aspect.
I'd appreciate it if we could get back to Louis' third question, which I was particularly interested in, the link between the transcendent function and your infant observation. Because I said one thing, that Jung developed his idea of the transcendent function after his loss of his relationship with Freud, as he saw it. And the infant, your little Matthew, and the mother were suffering from terrible loss in this catastrophic 19 days event. And I'm wondering whether you think that's connected with Louis' question about where do you link the transcendent function and the infant observation?
Well, I think that insofar as the transcendent function has to do with the process of symbolization.
Yeah. After stress, or growing out of stress. Pain. You talked about pain.
Yes, because the transcendent function is linked to the process of symbolization, which is, in my opinion, always coping with pain, coping with the void, coping with the unknown, coping with the something obscure and something which is not representable. And only when you can stand this unrepresentable part, something new can spring out.
Yes.
You know? Which is the life symbol.
And it didn't happen with Matthew and his mother, did it?
As far as I could observe, no. Because this was a situation where the void was unbearable. This mother absolutely couldn't stand the unpredictable and the dark side, the unknowable. And she had immediately to jump on it and to say, this is this and this is that.
Yes.
And so I think this is absolutely the opposite of the transcendent function, which implies the coming together of opposites.
The known and the unknown.
The known and the unknown, and just expecting that something new can come out.
Yes, you see, my difficulty with the idea of reverie is that it doesn't quite...
Sorry.
Sorry, the difficulty I have with the Bion idea of reverie, and the way in which the mother transforms the speech elements into alpha function. I mean, I have many difficulties with it, but one is that you would have to explain, for example, in your case, the mother would have to do more than know that the baby had intestinal colic, because she would have to find some way to transmit that knowledge to the baby in a way that the baby could understand. It would have to be transformed into from a sign into a symbol, to use Jung's way of distinguishing it. And of course, that would mean one would have to study the way mothers and babies communicate, really. You know, the sense in which they can express an understanding, which then enables the baby to feel held and to get through the experience. I'm only saying that Bion's idea is very sketchy in that respect, because he basically wasn't so interested in the mother. I mean, you're focusing our interest much more on the mother. And I think there's a lot of infant observation now which is studying communication, and it puts a great deal of emphasis on things like play, you see, not just on the feeding experience.
Louis, the infant observations that involve play and the infant research are done with babies in particular states of mind called alert states of mind, and that this is what you call the infant research, or what I call laboratory research, focuses on. That if the baby starts to cry, or if the baby needs a change, or gets upset, the observation is over.
Oh, that's
with many of them, and so they are looking at a particular area in infant mental life that is different than the areas looked at home observations, where you sit for an hour and you see whatever is there to be seen, and you see periods of intense feelings as well as these periods of play.
Yeah, there are certain points where play cannot take place because there's such very intense feelings, and the controversy is about what is going on at those times. You know, we can certainly imagine that the baby has no thoughts, that whatever it is not represented. I mean, that's fine. It's when you start talking about persecutory anxiety and bad objects being projected, and then, you know, it's all that area of climbing unconscious fantasy, which is actually very difficult to show one way or the other. But I don't think it's quite true that infant observers ignore all these other things that go on, but they talk about it in a rather different language.
That's not my understanding. They single out something to be observed rather than...
Sorry, Elizabeth, what did you say?
They single out something to be observed and tested in their laboratories.
The point I was making was to do with communication, how we understand communication of meaning, because I think that's really what you were wanting to focus on in making the connection with Jung. I think that when you actually say that Jung's idea of the symbol was not semantic. I think that's not quite right, because semantic means giving meaning. It's true that the meaning is something which is then of something which is ultimately unknown, which Jung, I mean, that was what Jung said. But it's this, the way in which the mother gives meaning to the baby's communications, which is the important thing, isn't it? The question is really whether Bion's idea goes far enough in understanding.
Well, yeah. We have two more. Yes, Jean.
Well, I just wanted to, it was really repeating, I think this is a terribly interesting paper, and it's interesting partly from a very practical point of view, that I think this is a marvellous description of a double bind being built up, that it's a picture of a mother who is who is attempting to cope with the baby when she's not in a state to be able to see the baby separately from herself. Which it seems to me that being a mother is not recognised how extraordinarily difficult it must be to actually have this minute human being behaving differently to oneself. And I feel it's a marvellous description of that sort of difficulty, but with a mother who really is in a borderline state and not able to allow her baby to develop, that she's got to teach the baby what in fact is her own perception of what should be going on. Thank you.
David?
Thank you. I feel I have a need to try and make sense of what has happened, or what I can glean from what has happened of your description of this baby, because I've got a paradox going on in my mind. On the one level, there's something quite bad going on, where the mother is incapable of meeting the needs of the child. And at the other end of the spectrum, I have to feel, rightly or wrongly, that quite a sturdy baby is growing. So there's some feed going on somewhere. And I don't know if you could actually describe this as a transcendent function, but it certainly might be a method that transcends the difficulties. I get the sense that the baby is by far the healthier of the two, psychologically, or at least implicitly. And that, in a sense, they're bound together. Call it projective identification if you want. I could also see it as the fact that they never got separated, and that in a sense there's a secret feed going on through the umbilical cord that hasn't actually been cut. Insofar as and the thing that links them is a collusion and a denial, because at the 19-day instance, the mother has to say, well, it's the bad lady who came this morning that's made my poor baby Matthew ill. And I'm not arguing where the projection comes from, the mother or the baby, but certainly I think if the mother perceived something bad outside herself in this bad woman that visited, the baby would probably respond to the anxiety on the mother's face at seeing this badness outside. But it's a badness that has to be denied, it has to be outside rather than inside the mother. And in a sense, I know there can be a language difficulty, but the words that Matthew kept muttering of who is it or something.
Who is it?
Almost made me think, was he really saying who did it, or who made that nasty smell? In other words, he's also denying and colluding and saying it was, just like the mother is saying, I'm not the bad mother who can't cope and therefore my baby's got colic, it's this nasty woman out here. Matthew is also saying, I'm not the nasty baby that's made that nasty smell, but somebody else did it. Who did it? So the thing that combines the two of them together is this, to me, is this sort of collusion and denial. And if they are bound
having the
together,
ball in his
then
hand.
the feed can happen. And so I feel that this baby actually managed to find a way of feeding off this, at one level, inadequate mother who really wasn't well enough to mother empathically. And the baby sensed this way of it, and thereby some feeding could happen. But it was more the baby fitting in and perceiving what the mother was capable of.
I absolutely agree with you.
Yes.
I think we must really regretfully bring this to a close, and my regret is that for me this paper really was so